This is Big Tasty Sports.
Last time, we wrapped up the NFC. We made it all the way through the 4 divisions. That can only mean one thing. It's time to have JJ on the podcast. And also time to start the AFC. JJ, welcome for the first time for one of these NFL shows, man. How you doing?
Thanks. My debut, the last go around, got sidelined for obvious reasons. But thanks for having me back.
Absolutely, yes. I'm glad that what was going on last time has passed and is no longer
for 10 years.
Literally and metaphorically passed. All right, Yanni back with us again as well. Yanni donning the Bills hat. I mean, it's almost like you're anticipating us moving from the West to the East. You know, we're just a few weeks away.
You know, no disrespect to the Eagles and a couple others, but we got the JV behind us now. Let's dive into the AFC. Let's get into the varsity here, right?
Can't wait. It should be exciting. All right, before we jump into the first team, do just want to say it's actually been awesome. A lot of people have been checking out the videos, a lot of comments, which has been awesome. Really appreciate you guys jumping in and making those comments. Please do hit a like on the video, subscribe, and make those comments. It's actually been fun reading through it. Some people think about why different teams will do well or not. A lot of Justin Fields love out there. So, Yanni and I may be a little lower, but we'll see. Maybe those Justin Fields lovers that we'll be right. We'll see. But yeah, keep that coming. And we'll enjoy that as we keep going through these teams. So today we're in the AFC West, and we are going to start out with the Denver Broncos. Over under of 8.5 plus 106 to the over, minus 106 to the under. Again, if this is your first time, these are the best lines across 5 books that I track. So that's why it doesn't look like minus 110 plus 110 or whatever, or minus 110 on each side, actually. Division plus 700. And first 8 games, which is something we've been focusing on here, they start out with the Raiders and the Commanders at home, at Miami, at Chicago, the Jets, at Kansas City on a Thursday, and then Green Bay and Kansas City at home. And the obvious place to start here is that Sean Payton comes in as the head coach after the complete and utter failure of Nathaniel Hackett. Year 2 for Russ Wilson in Denver. And I think I'm going to go through some other stuff, but I do think a lot can come down here to whether Russ can cook again or not, to use the common language. Denver's a really interesting team to me. You look at going through the offense and defense. On the offensive line, PFF has them ranked as number 11, up from number 21, and they did make some nice moves there. Bulls only played 5 games last year, so that was definitely a blow to that line. They also added Mike McGlinchey and Ben Powers, so they really beefed up the offensive line, and I think should have a much more solid unit there. When you look across this division, I think that's going to be a little bit of a theme, actually. Which makes this an interesting division to talk about. But I think the Broncos have moved themselves into a spot where their line, if it performs well, should be in the top half of the league at the very least, and maybe has an upside better than that. So that's good. I think the skill position group looks pretty good as well. I mean, Jerry Jeudy is a really talented receiver if you can get him the ball. They also have Cortland Sutton, who has shown flashes of being able to go up and get the ball. He's a big receiver, and I think can play really well against coverage, even if he doesn't get a ton of separation. Tim Patrick may be back to full strength. They haven't had Tim Patrick at full strength for a while. Drafted Marvin Mims Jr. They picked up Marquez Callaway, and then from a few years ago, a guy that they used to be high on, KJ Hamler. Not a great receiver, but if he can come in and be like your 4th guy, I think there's some depth here in the receiving core, I guess is what I say. So some teams, if they have a key receiver go down, that's ball game for them. Minnesota Vikings would be a case in point. I think the Broncos are a little different, where they have a little bit of depth. Tight end's not as exciting. They have Greg Dulcich, who maybe is okay, but definitely not anything to get too pumped about. And then they added Samaje Perine for at running back. There's really no depth there unless Williams can come back, but that looks very iffy. And if he does, what kind of state he'll be in. And so I think the running back position is a little bit concerning. The biggest thing on offense for the Broncos is their 4th string quarterback. They have Ben DiNucci. I was very excited when I looked at the depth chart and saw that Ben DiNucci was on the Broncos. That brings a lot of leadership and opportunity to play well for a series or something. So real big on the offense. So anyway, that's the offense. Defense was really good last year. I mean, I'm not going to go through all this, but man, the talk of the Broncos last year, right, was could they score 17 points? Because if they could actually win a game, because the defense kept them in it week after week after week as the offense imploded and Russ could do nothing. They were 7th in yards per game, 13th in points per game, number 12 yards per rush, number 7 QBR allowed, number 9 in sacks. So pretty solid across the board. And the strength here is the secondary. Really strong. Surtain, Kareem Jackson, Justin Simmons. It's a really good secondary. I do think the defensive line is concerning when you go out and sign a shadow of Frank Clark to come in and provide some competition on the defensive line. It's not a good sign. So I'm not sure how good the defensive line can be. But I think that this is a defense that should be good again and should be able to keep them in games. So for me, a lot of this does come back to can they run the ball consistently, give Russ time, and then can Russ recover and have something more like the seasons he had in Seattle than the horrible one that he had last year in Denver. So I think this is an interesting team. Yanni, what do you think about the Broncos?
Very interesting team. You touched on a lot of the points there. I'm going to disagree with you just on one point that you made there. I think a guy that I'm high on is Dulcich at tight end. I think he's a guy that he showed some ability when he was kind of plugged in that lineup. And now that he's got a little experience, a little bit of cohesiveness with Russell Wilson there, he might be able to make some things happen. But realistically, I think on offense, it really, to me, comes down to two things. You talked about the offensive line, which I agree should be improved, getting Bowles back, adding McGlinchey and Powers. I mean, they should be a better group. And when you give Sean Payton a quarterback time to throw, you can make some things happen. So I think Jerry Jeudy is a really interesting guy. I've looked at a lot of things that say Judy's one of those potential breakout guys. And in fairness, I know I've been saying Judy's going to be a breakout guy since he came into the league. Hasn't really happened yet. But I think that, maybe between the offensive line being better and Peyton coming in, maybe it is. So to your point, the defense is going to be decent. How good they're going to be, I don't know, but they'll be at least average, if not towards the top end of the league. So to your point, can the offense get a little bit going to keep them competitive when they get in those games with the Chargers or with the Chiefs or some of these teams that can score points? I think the answer is yes. I mean, I don't know how much Sean Payton counts in terms of wins per season, points per game, any of that. We'll obviously have to wait and find out. But I think that the pieces are there. And there is one other thing that you mentioned on the defensive line, and that's Zach Allen. He's a guy coming over that I think has a lot of potential. He's kind of that cliche high motor guy, one of those kind of guys. But I mean, to me, when you watched him play, you literally, if you're watching from a distance, you're like, is that JJ Watt? No, it's Zach Allen. So, he's kind of that poor man's JJ Watt, right? And I mean, is he going to be a JJ Watt caliber? No, probably not. But can he be a guy that you can count on to get to the quarterback, to eat up some blocks, to allow maybe a veteran like Frank Clark or Randy Gregory or one of these guys to get after it? So I think this team has a very high ceiling. Do they have enough to overtake a team like the Chiefs or even the Chargers? I'm not sure, but I definitely think it's possible that this team could be very good. I don't want to bet on them being great just yet, and we can obviously talk about that, but I think that at the end of the day, they have a high ceiling.
JJ, any thoughts on the Broncos?
I mean, one of my points that I circled here was a risk reward, kind of team. So with all these unknowns coming off of 22, what do you make of that? What do you make of Russell Wilson? Is Sean Payton the guy to kind of transition him into these, we'll just say, kind of like the late phase of his career? We've seen that with quarterbacks in the past. We've seen Sean Payton transition, a Drew Brees rubber arm type of situation into, a contender type of team. Is Russell Wilson, is he going to respond to that sort of coaching and scheme? We'll see. But I think the offensive line upgrades, as Yanni mentioned, are key to that. Both of you mentioned that the Frank Clark situation, obviously is a little bit of a question mark in terms of what sort of effectiveness that's going to bring to the defense as a whole. As everybody knows, the defensive line is kind of the catalyst of how the defense is going to perform. But Allegedly, we still have a strong secondary, back there. But if the defensive line can't perform, how much pressure can they withstand? I think this team, you almost had to kind of throw out the last few weeks of the last season, with how just things seem to snowball downhill and, go get out of control. But one thing to consider, is just how much money, how much, emphasis, I guess you would say, of the cap and the payroll last year was spent on the injured reserve. So that is something that if they can kind of dodge some of those bullets, kind of makes on this team. So looking at Delta from 22 to 23, a lot of questions, but I think, and the market has responded obviously too with an accomplished head coach like Sean Payton. So that is factored into there. But, is there any value in something like all totals with this team with kind of the big risk reward profile would be the question that I have. Whether it's worth it. Again, KC being the class of the division, pretty tough to look at, but what was he at? Are they at like 6 or 7 to 1 to win the division? Not sure that's a bet, but whether alt totals could capture a higher ceiling with that combination of Peyton and Wilson transitioning.
Yeah, I think it is a good question too. I mean, an over under at 8.5. I feel like it's set pretty well again. Like there's two things that I'll say about it. Number one is I do have their schedule is the easiest of any team in this division. And so I think that that's something that bodes well for them. I mean, you even look at the first 8 and I think you have to at least kind of like them in at least 3 of their first 5 at home. And you continue into the second half of the season and the schedule outside the division is still not incredibly difficult. I mean, there's some hard games there, but all the teams have some hard games. I was looking back at Russell Wilson just to come back to that for a minute. And you look at his performance last year and his completion percentage was 60.5, which is the lowest of his career, 16 touchdowns, 5 below the lowest of his career. 11 interceptions, but the interception percentage was 2.3, which is tied for the worst of his career. So it was a career worst year across the board for Russell Wilson. And that to me, this is one where, there's recency bias in betting too. And it's not that recent anymore, but I will remember for the rest of my life, my take on the Broncos for 2022, which was that they were going to be really good. And then they really sucked. So I was way off. And it makes me a little hesitant to get too high on this team. But I think, Yanni, something you said too, when you said that we were done with the JV and we're getting to the varsity, half joking, but there's a little bit of truth there. I mean, when you think about this team going up against Green Bay or Washington, it's like we talked about Green Bay. There's some volatility and maybe they'll be okay. But I think these are different levels between the teams like in the AFC West here. And even we'll get to that when we talk about the Raiders, where I even have some questions about the levels there. And so I like the Broncos again. I'm not rushing to bet them at over 8.5, but you do get plus money on it right now. I have them 5-3 after the first 8, which is a solid start, if the win total is 9. Thoughts from you guys on that first half and how you see it playing out with that schedule?
I've got them. I think you kind of mentioned I've got them at 4-4 through the first 8, and I think that's very conservative. Obviously, they got a couple games with Kansas City there that are going to be tough, and certainly I think in this division, if you're not the Chiefs and you can steal a win from them, I think that goes a long way in how your season goes. So obviously, one of those games, obviously a home game, for example, is an important opportunity for them. But you're right. I mean, you look at their first couple games, they could be 2-0 out of the gate there. And, I think that when I have them at 4-4, this is a team to me, and again, not to kind of take the easy way out, but they could be 2-6. They could be 6-2, after 8 games. It's hard to really pinpoint them. So I kind of went the chicken way out and said, they're probably going to, split a couple of those games, maybe win one, lose one. And that's why I got them at 4-4 out of the gate.
And, I think to go back to that first half, if you will, it's going to be very telling, obviously, when it comes to what we're going to get with this Peyton Wilson relationship, lack of running back depth, upgraded offensive line. But and it's probably been talked about all over the place this offseason, but what was the mindset of Russell Wilson? He looked lost, he looked indecisive. they're going to be a massive sea change back to a confident Russell Wilson, but a different style of Russell. I don't know. So there's a lot of questions that I think we all want to ask. But nonetheless, I think just coaching has been a significant issue for this team for the last few seasons. So, unless Peyton's just totally taken, outside of the game, has lost it, I think that is a significant upgrade. It's reflected in the price, but I think the intangibles with Russell Wilson and the direction that he's going to go, the mindset and execution is what we need to see play out.
All right. Well, let's move to any player props, or we've done some other bets too, that are out there that you might like. I just have one for this team, but I'll let you guys jump in first if there's anything you like. Yanni, you got something?
Well, the only thing that I have for them is, and actually, I ended up, I've got it jotted down here, but at the end of the day, I backed off on it, and it had to do with Russell Wilson. And, again, I think there's just too much unknown in regards to what Sean Payton can do. And it had to do with his passing touchdowns. I looked at initially obviously, he was terrible last year. We've already talked about that. But when you look at the previous 6 of 7 years, he demolished what his touchdown prop was. So it's kind of like, but again, are we going to get that Russell Wilson back? Is Sean Payton going to develop him? I don't feel comfortable betting on that until I see it. So I ended up passing. I actually don't have anything regarding Denver's props.
The only thing that I had, I wrote it down. I'm not betting this, but let me ask first, do you, Yanni or JJ, do you guys have any more information about whether Williams is supposed to be back this year? Like when he's supposed to be back, any of that stuff?
So what I've read, and I followed some of there's a lot of really good Twitter accounts that are like the NFL doctors, right? They kind of give you the perspective of that. What I've read is they are anticipating him to probably be ready around the start of the season.
Okay.
But what they're saying though is with an injury like his, he's kind of that prototypical, it's going to take a year to fully get back into it. So it's like, how effective is he going to be? Is he going to have that strength? Is he going to have that burst? Is he going to be able to be healthy? So I think you're right. I mean, we could see a lot of Samaje Perine to start the season. And, when Perine played in Cincinnati, he was very effective. But as we always talk about, it's different when you're getting 6 carries a game versus if you're asked to be that guy, who's getting the ball and carry the load. So I think that you're right. There's some question marks there, running the football. But if you think back to Sean Payton-led offenses in New Orleans, he was really good at plugging the next running back in throughout his career there. And again, I think it has to do a lot with building that offensive line and kind of the scheme that they run. But there were a lot of guys when you go back that Saints roster, when all the way back to Deuce McAllister and, through Mark Ingram and all the way through Kamara, where when those guys were down, they'd plug the next guy in, and it's a guy you had never heard of, and they're rattling off 100-yard games and they're punching it in. So I think, to me, I'm not as worried about that, just because to me, it's a little bit of that Kyle Shanahan effect where it's like, I think if your offensive line and your scheme is good, they're going to be able to run the ball either way. So I'm not too worried about Javonte Williams, Samaje Perine. I think they'll be okay with that.
Well, and that's probably a reason. I was just looking at the over on Perine touchdowns. I think when they get down close, they might want to punch it in. But I think what you just said would be a reason not to as well. I mean, and we've talked before about taking overs as dicey, and probably especially when we don't know how durable he'll be and that kind of stuff. But I just thought, I think the rushing touchdowns in Denver in general could be a good look this year. But I'm not sure you want to pin it all on Perine. So not to use too much alliteration. All right. Well, let's move on to the next team in the division. This is the prohibitive favorite, of course, the Kansas City Chiefs. Their over-under is set at 11.5, and it is juiced to the over -125, +120 to the under. They did get to 14 wins last year, so they cleared that mark very easily a season ago. -160 is the best price you can find for them to win the division. They start with the Detroit Lions. JJ's Detroit Lions on Thursday at home. Opening night of the season. Should be a fun one. Then they're at Jacksonville, Chicago. They go on a road trip to the Jets and the Vikings. Then they have the first of those 2 games with Denver at home on a Thursday night. They have the Chargers come to town, and then they go to Denver. That's the first 8. Yanni, why don't you kick this off? Does Patrick Mahomes easily lead this team to another division crown?
Well, I don't think it'll be easy. I'll start by saying that, but I'll also say that I thought they would struggle a little bit last year. Maybe not struggle. That's probably not the right word, but I didn't think it was going to be easy last year, and they just kind of did what they do, right? They just kind of find ways to win games and make things happen. And at this point, we've all figured it out. It's not a secret, but go to Bill Walsh and Joe Montana, you go to Brady and Belichick, and this is the new version of that. You got Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes. How are all three of those teams? Quarterback, coach, good offensive line. And that's what we have with the Chiefs. You can question the other pieces on this team all day long, but we know they're going to be able to block. We know Mahomes is Mahomes, and we know Andy Reid can come up with, the most amazing play calls and get his team ready to play every week. So I think obviously they've earned that right to be the favorite. I think they should be the favorite. But, the question here is, okay, so a year ago we lost Tyreek Hill. Offense didn't skip a beat. In fact, they were actually a little bit better statistically with that. I think the question this year is Travis Kelce. At some point, the juice is going to go out of that body, right? Like it's not going to be there. But when is that? Is it this year? Is it next year? Is it 2 years from now? When is that? And that's the hard part with this offense, because Kelce is obviously the key to that passing game and the offense really in general. And if he can give them what he gave them last year, this team's going to be fine. They're going to go over their win total. They're going to be, fighting to play in the Super Bowl, all that stuff. If he shows signs of slowing down, do they have enough to overcome that, even with Mahomes and Reid? So to me, that's the question. But Kelce has shown no signs of slowing down yet. So I'm certainly not banking on that. I'm going to believe that he's going to be again, an all-pro tight end who gets his 1,200 plus yards and his, 10 touchdowns and whatever. I think, to me, the biggest question mark on this team is Kadarius Toney, because I think he's got the skill set to be that Tyreek Hill in this offense that can keep this offense explosive. And we bag on Juju Smith-Schuster, and, he wasn't great last year, but he was consistent. He was a guy that Mahomes could go to on third down. He was a guy that when Kelce was double teamed, he could get open and make that catch. So without him, you look and you say, who is it? Is it Sky Moore? Is it, who's that guy that can step up? I think Toney is the X factor on this offense here. If he can give them what he's capable of, this is going to be, again, potentially the number one offense in the league. If not, then maybe they take a little bit of a step back. Defensively, I think, I've gotten to the point where I don't care. I don't even pay attention to the defense here, right? It's like, okay, we know they've got Chris Jones. Kudos, by the way, to them. They drafted really well. And, when you're picking 31st and 32nd and 30th in the draft, and you're able to get guys that come in and not only contribute, but play really well, I think you got to give, that organization a lot of credit as a whole. They're able to kind of plug in cornerbacks and linebackers and find guys that are quality players. But to me, this isn't, as long as Mahomes and Reid are there, this is never going to be about the defense. So I don't even spend a whole lot of time looking at that. I think that this team's way to victory is scoring 30 points. And that's what we're seeing here is, are they going to be able to put up 30 points consistently? To me, they've shown no signs that they won't. So I do think that this division and really the conference is still theirs to lose. Although the last thing I'll say is, we've talked about it, I think, on every one of our division previews. A lot of these teams made improvements in the offseason. They got better, whether you're talking about the Bengals or the Chargers or the Bills or the Ravens or the Jets or the Dolphins, whoever. This Kansas City team, I don't think you can look at and say got better year over year. In fact, they may not be as good as a year ago, but when you're the Super Bowl champions, you don't necessarily have to get a whole lot better. You just kind of got to hold serve there. So, to me, it's like, it's one of those things where at some point, who's done enough to lap them? And at this point, no one's proven that. So I'm still leaning on KC and saying, until something happens there, I think it's their division to lose.
JJ, agreement, disagreement, other thoughts?
Pretty much agree. I think, 22, if we talk about net year over year change in terms of personnel, coaching, whatever, with Kansas City, it was personnel. Obviously, like Yanni detailed, this is a Mahomes plus Reid scheme equals stability. And we don't, after the questions we asked of this team in 22 with losing key personnel, with the weapons on the offensive side. Yet really no statistical drop off, no performance drop off, no wins drop off, and obviously a Super Bowl win. Kind of causes us to take a step back in 23 and say, okay, well, if this is a stagnant roster or even a slight downgrade of a roster, do we need to be even more critical than we were going to 22? In Mahomes and Reed, we trust when it comes to offense. I think that's what Yanni is saying, and they've shown no reason to doubt that otherwise. The Kelsey thing is spot on. He was obviously a machine, a go-to, undefendable in the middle of the field. But until we've seen those signs of significant drop-off, whether it be ability, injury, effectiveness, whatever, you have to really trust the fact that Mahomes to Kelsey trust and significant and can cause some of those fringe guys on the outside or even a Tony to become more dangerous. But that's the same for 22 to 23. Where I'm at, though, is you have a very tough out of division in the second half, Cincinnati, Buffalo, and Philadelphia, but they're all at home. So, what do you say about that? The path for the Kansas City Chiefs in terms of schedule and where they're playing some of these tougher teams is important. So we look at division in terms of less of what Kansas City's change is from 22 to 23 compared to the Broncos, the Chargers, less so the Raiders. Are the Chargers going to become a legitimate division contender and get out of their own way? And does Denver have enough firepower, which we just talked about? I don't think they have enough firepower to challenge Kansas City, despite taking the step up. So you're right. They are the class of the division until proven otherwise, and 23 should not be the year for that.
All right. No significant I think I'm basically on the same page with what you guys said. A few other things that I'll throw in. Matt Nagy takes over for Eric Bieniemy. I don't think that's a downgrade, personally. The offensive line, not that we have to hit it, but just to cover it a little bit, they did let Orlando Brown go to Cincinnati, which obviously is a big loss, but brought in Jawan Taylor and added Donovan Smith from the Bucs too. So I think overall that line didn't take a step back. So that's big. Lost Juju and Hardman, drafted Rashee Rice. But here's a couple things I'll throw in. One of the things is I remember last year feeling like the Chiefs toyed with losing a lot. It would almost be like they didn't try that hard until we got to the second half, and then they would turn it on and they would win the game, which on the one hand you could take as a negative, like, man, why are they playing with their food like that? On the other hand, it's like, well, shit, if they try hard, I guess that they win. And I was amazed going back. I did not remember this. I went back to look at their losses. They went 14-3, and their losses were by 3, 4, and 3 points. So they legitimately could have won those games as well, with some of the same issues last year as they'll have this year. So that, I think, is a big deal. Another thing is last year I did a lot of different things with turnovers, and I've been doing that this year too. And obviously you have to take all this stuff with a grain of salt because it's all complex. It's not so simple. But one of the things I did is I took the percentage that teams win, given how much they win or lose the turnover battle by, and did a wins over expectation. And what I found was that it was the best teams in the league who are the highest on wins over expectation based on turnovers, which makes sense because the good teams can overcome turnovers. So you had Kansas City, Buffalo, Minnesota was actually in there surprisingly, but Philly, Dallas, San Francisco, Cincinnati, what you'd expect. But I had Kansas City 5.5 wins over expectation. The next best was 4.78 on Buffalo. So this is a team that was just good enough to overcome stuff. And I think it does come back to Reed, Mahomes, that offensive line. The concern for me with Kansas City is the same as what you guys have already shared, and that's the skill position. Yes, Mahomes is good enough to get the ball to anyone, and that's why I wouldn't pick against Kansas City to win this division either. But I do think, like, you talked a lot about Kadarius Toney, Yanni, and Kadarius Toney falls in the same category to me a little bit as the Lions this year. Everybody knows that the Lions can be great, but they haven't been. And there's a sense in which they need to prove it. And I feel like it's been, ever since he came into the league, hearing about how great Kadarius Toney can be, and then there's injuries or other excuses for why he can't be. I mean, he had a couple good plays for Kansas City last year, but with him, I feel like I need to see him prove it before I can believe that he can be a great player in the NFL. I just don't see him reaching that potential so far. And I'm not sure he's going to just jump up and grab it because Juju Smith-Schuster is out of town now.
He's got a, I don't mean to cut you off. He's got to me, he has a very interesting comp from earlier, and that's Percy Harvin. Another Florida guy. All the skill, all the athleticism, all the flash, all the ability, but can he stay healthy? Does he have that mental, toughness to get there? To me, they're identical, but that's why he is the X factor on this team. I mean, with this offense and his ability, he could have 1,400 yards receiving and 12 touchdowns easily, in my opinion. Now, whether or not he does, to your point, he hasn't proven that he can. So, I think to me, that's why I said he's the X factor. He's a really interesting player in the league this year.
Yeah, I love that comp too. I mean, as a Vikings fan, I remember Percy Harvin very well. I remember getting so excited because he would make unbelievable plays and then he wouldn't show up for 3 games.
Yep.
So yeah, that's a great comp. Overall, go ahead, JJ.
No, I was just going to say, and this is, if he can't do it here in this scheme with this quarterback, with Andy Reid, he's not going to do it at all. So
yeah, totally agree.
Yeah. Right.
Totally agree.
Yeah. Last thing, Tasty, if I could say this, you brought up a really interesting point, and I actually almost said this too, is the Chiefs, to me at this point, they're a little bit like the Golden State Warriors were, a few years back, where it's like, yeah, sometimes they sleepwalk through and it's like, how hard are they really trying? But when they need to turn it on and win, they can. To me, I was like, is that a concern? But I think the difference is when you look at some of those NBA teams that operate that way, it's a grind, right? So it's a little different. In the NFL, you got 17 games. You don't really take a week off. So even like you said, I don't worry too much about the focus there. I think Andy Reid will, keep them focused. But you do bring up a good point. Sometimes you're like, why are they letting this team hang around? Like, why, it just seemed like you said, kind of like they were going through the motion rather than really focused on what they needed to be doing.
Yeah. And I think the problem that can cause, it obviously didn't affect them last year, is if you do that enough in the NFL, it's one bad bounce at the end of a game, and then you don't have enough time to come back. So I think if they do that, it's not going to cause them problems in terms of making the playoffs or probably even winning the division, but it could mess with win totals or losing some more games than they need to. So, well, let's talk about what we see for the first 8 games. This might be this is probably a little bit low or negative toward them, but I have them at 5-3. I think that first 8 is tough, and some of those tough games are on the road. So they should be in some good games. And Yanni, you've said it. Could they be 8-0? Sure, they're a great team. But I have them at 5-3.
Yeah, I've got them at 5-3 also. And I think realistically, when I first went through, I had them at 6-2. But I kind of looked and said, okay, you look at a few of those games like at Jacksonville or even the Lions, now granted that's at home and they have all off season to prepare, but then you're like, maybe they'll slip up in one of those, especially like we just talked about, if maybe they're not completely focused yet, or they're trying to still maybe figure out the passing game a little bit, that kind of a thing. So I've actually got them at 5-3 as well after the first 8. Would I be shocked if they're better than that? No, I think they could absolutely be 6-2, 7-1, whatever. But I have at 5-3 also.
JJ, how about you?
Sure.
Okay.
No, I'm with you. You just don't know. We're going to see them fire out of the gates. I mean, I think the Detroit's going to, kind of run into a buzzsaw there with the prototypical. This is not just a bye week, coming out of the bye week. It's coming out of the off season. But Jacksonville's tripped some teams up at home over the last few years, even when they weren't as good as they are now. So, yeah, I'm going to chalk up that variability. There's a couple losses pending there. But I wouldn't be surprised if they're 7-1 either.
All right. Any props on Kansas City?
Yeah, I've got a couple. To me, the obvious one, and this seems too, you never want to say this when you're betting, but this seems a little too obvious to me. Mahomes over touchdowns. It's at 26.5, which is a little over 1.5 per game. When you bet his weekly touchdowns per week, it's usually set at 2.5 to give you an idea, right? So, for season long, again, and we say it every podcast, injury, of course, aside, to me, it's a no-brainer. And you look back, he had 41 last year, 37 the year before, 38 the year before. So he's not just mildly getting over 26 and a half. He's destroying that number. So to me, that's when you look at it. It's like, I feel like you have to bet that. I mean, it's just out there, and it's like, you got to do it. So that's the first one. And I think a lot of it too, we also have to factor in, scheme. And what I mean by that is, this is a true fact. Nobody throws more 2-yard touchdowns than Patrick Mahomes. That's not to take away from how good he is, but they don't get to the 1-yard line and hand the ball off. That's not what they do. I think Andy Reid gets his rocks off on figuring out ways to have a left tackle catch a pass. Yeah. It's like he loves, dancing in circles and shovel pass into a backup tight end. And like, he loves that stuff. So I feel like by default, you get 6 or 7 touchdowns a year from stuff like that most teams turn around and hand the ball off to the running back. So, I think that, that in itself, that's obvious. And then the other one that I mentioned, and you bring up a good point. So I certainly can understand if someone were hesitant on this, but it's Kadarius Toney over 630 yards. To me, I don't know who will end up being the number one receiver outside of Travis Kelce, obviously, on this offense, but I think it's going to be Toney. And when you looked at how the Chiefs kind of finished up the season, you saw him getting more involved in the offense as it went. So I think they kind of start with, okay, last year was his basically preseason with the Chiefs, where they were figuring out how to use this guy and get comfortable with Mahomes. I think that part's over with. I think Toney ends up, injury aside, I think he ends up 1,000-yard receiver this year. So I'm looking at Toney there. I think there's a good cushion if he stays healthy.
All right, I have one to add, and I probably won't bet this only because I am betting some other people for Defensive Player of the Year, but it's Chris Jones for Defensive Player of the Year at plus 2,500. Mm-hmm. This is a guy who's had 15 and a half sacks twice in his career and is just a game wrecker when he's healthy. And this defense is going to be interesting. I didn't talk about it a lot, but I think it's a young unit that played pretty well at the end of last year. And so I think that if the defense can be solid, that may be a piece of the Chiefs that we, like you said, you don't even need to count on because you have Mahomes. But I could see Chris Jones at least being in that conversation. We've talked about other guys who can, be there with Bosa and the others at, 12, 13, 14, 15 sacks. And I think Chris Jones is one of those guys. So I think that's at least interesting, even though I'm unlikely to bet it. JJ, any props or other bets for you?
I don't have any, but Yanni's point about Mahomes and kind of these creative ways to score touchdowns, kind of made me think real quick. And I looked up, that they were one of the 4 most successful pass, right up there with San Francisco, Deebo Samuel, all that sort of thing. But right up there with the Ravens, the Niners, and the Lions. But, that's just shows, the scheme, the talent, and the ability to just get the ball in the right person's hands and score. So, I'll just go back to Yanni's point in terms of he's been smashing it. Even if you take several games out for potential injury, even though Mahomes is young enough, those tendons are rubbery enough to where obviously we saw him come from a devastating injury. The guy's going to be on the field plenty to make up that over touchdown. I think that's pretty slick.
Yeah, I thought the same. As we talk through props, there have been a couple that have hit me enough that I've actually bet them. And Yanni, I wrote that one down because I definitely do think that over is one. And again, I mean, if what I have to bet on is Mahomes not getting injured, I mean, with the cushion you talked about, we've seen Mahomes get injured, and obviously in a playoff game, it was ridiculous how he played through stuff. But even in the regular season, even if he sits a couple games, I don't think that bet is dead. It would only be dead if he gets a major injury and is out for a long time. So right. I like that. Right. Okay, well, let's move on to the next team here, and that is the Los Angeles Chargers. Over under set at 9.5, minus 108 to the over, plus 105 to the under, plus 340 to win the division. They start out with Miami, traveling across the country to LA. Then they go to Tennessee and Minnesota. The Raiders come to town. Then they have an early bye. So bye in week 5 for the Chargers. play Dallas on a Monday night at home, at Kansas City, Chicago at home, and then they go across the country to play the Jets. So when we look at the Chargers, man, this is a team that's always just knocking on the door of being great. It's another one of those teams that you always expect more from than what you get. And I think the same is true in many ways again this year. You look at their offensive line, PFF actually has them up from number 17 to number 9. Rashawn Slater is one of the best left tackles in the league. So if he stays healthy, he anchors that line. And I only know this from looking it up other places. I'm not going to pretend I actually just knew this like Yanni would actually just know this. But Jamari Saylor, I looked at his stats. He had to play left tackle last year when Slater was out and played really well. So he's moving to left guard this year. So the left side of that line should be phenomenal and pretty good across the board. Then you have Justin Herbert behind that line, who we know is a great quarterback, and they should be able to give him time, should be able to create holes for Austin Eckler to be able to run the ball. This is a good skill unit, at least, with Mike Williams. Keenan Allen getting older. I kind of wonder, Yanni, like you said about Travis Kelce, does Keenan Allen, when does he hit that time where maybe he's still good but not great? I know he's dealt with some injuries as well. Quentin Johnson is a rookie that they drafted, still have Jalen Guyton. And then Gerald Everett at tight end is a good receiving option from the tight end position. Eckler is back despite flirting with him not being back. So I think this, again, is an offense that should be really good. I mean, they're good across the board. Are there teams that have better units at every position? Sure. But this is a team that skill position, offensive line, quarterback, I mean, at least in a couple of those categories, like top 10 in the league. So they should be good. The question may be more on the defensive side, and it really comes down to them stopping the run. That was the story last year, right? Is the defense was okay when it came to defending the pass, but they were not good defending the run. Bosa did miss 12 games. Derwin James missed 3. So obviously those are big losses for that defense because those are good players, great players even. They gave up 145.8 yards per game. So people basically ran on them whenever they wanted to. And they haven't done a lot to address that on the interior of the line or with the linebackers, at least I don't think enough to necessarily change it. Will it change or not? I don't know. I'm interested to hear what you guys think about the defense as well, because when I look across this division, as we've been talking about, I think at least these first 3 teams all have the ability to be pretty good and are pretty solid across the board. And so part of what I start to look for is what is the thing that's going to trip these teams up when they play each other. And I think this ability to stop the run or not is one of those things. Especially I was thinking about the Chargers versus the Broncos. And I think the Broncos are a team that's going to hang their hat on the run a bit and have the line to be able to do it. Peyton with the scheme to do it. So is that something that Denver in particular could be able to exploit? If the Raiders get Josh Jacobs back, if he ends up coming and playing and not holding out, I wonder about that. So, Yanni, what are your thoughts on the defense and on the rest of the Chargers?
You nailed this one spot on. And actually, JJ made the perfect comment earlier when he said the Chargers have to get out of their own way. I mean, that's what this team is. And some of it is what I would call bad luck. You mentioned injuries to guys like Bosa and James and Slater, and, Keenan Allen missed a lot of time last year. Mike Williams missed some time. So,
Right.
It's hard to be super critical because we talk about it all the time. This isn't your average right guard missing time. I mean, these are all Pro Bowl caliber type players missing time. And when you have multiple of that, it's hard to be consistent. Now, I think we didn't really talk yet about coaching. And I know I've been hypercritical of Brandon Staley from day one. And not that I am against analytics, not that I am against aggressive play calling, because I like that. I think, you do need to know when to go for it on 4th down, and you should be aggressive, particularly when you're playing a team like Kansas City or whatever. But there are certain situations where, I'm sorry, when you're on your own 16-yard line, you don't go for it on 4th down. I don't care what the scenario, like, you just don't do that. And, and you look at that and you say, analytics, whatever, that can cost you a game, which can cost you a division, which can cost you a home game. I mean, there's like ramifications that go down the line with that. So I think that, as long as Staley's there, there's always going to be that concern to me. But when I look at this team, I actually have the Chargers offensive line ranked as 6th in the league. I think they're going to be one of the top units, that can really, they'll be able to run the ball. They can give Herbert the time he needs. And I think that addition of Quentin Johnson is big because now, like you said, you mentioned Gerald Everett. Yeah. You potentially have 3 really good athletic receivers out there, along with a tight end and a running back who catches the ball. How do you defend that? If you're trying to stop that, it's like, you look at that, and in those games when Allen and Williams were on the field together, that offense was really good. I mean, and they were actually pretty decent even without those guys, but the difference between was pretty substantial. So, you look at that and say, are they going to hit the injury bug yet again? At some point, you got to think that evens out to where, okay, that's not happening. Like, they're able to keep a lot of their guys on the field. And it's certainly not due to a lack of talent, but you mentioned really the critical piece here, which of all the things that happened in the offseason, this was probably one of the more bigger head scratchers for me. And that is that run defense. They were awful last year. I mean, you talked about it, and they did nothing, at least on paper, to make that better. Now, yes, obviously, if Bosa and James are on the lineup, I mean, you got to think that'll help a little bit. But realistically, they didn't address that. And I understand that in today's NFL, that's not your number one priority. Stopping the run is not priority number one. Usually it's not 1988 anymore where that was the case. But there's a difference between being 20th in the league at stopping the run and giving up 110 yards a game versus being 31st or 32nd and giving up 150 yards a game. I mean, there's a big difference there. So that to me is still the question mark here. But I will say this, if there is a team that, they would shock a lot of what I would say the average fan to get to the Super Bowl, but probably not a lot of people that really look at this, it would be the Chargers. I think that, the average guy that catches a couple games on Sunday, here and there, they'd probably be like, wow, the Chargers, yeah, this team made the Super Bowl. I don't think any of us would be shocked. I really don't, because I think the talent is there, the quarterback's there, the offensive line's there. The difference between the Chiefs and the Chargers is that head coach, the Andy Reid combination versus Brandon Staley to me. So that's a long way of saying this team has all the ability to win 14 games and be amazing. But do I think they're going to do that? No, I don't.
How about you, JJ? Do you think they're going to win 14 games?
I don't think they do. This is something that Yanni and I have joked about for years. And even with the change from Anthony and a lot of questionable decision-making, game management, all that sort of thing, the team still struggled, like I said, to get out of its own way. Last year, Staley, different approach, but almost like same result. So I really need to see better results for some of this decision-making, game management and such. I mean, Herbert's got the talent. Question in terms of, whether he can get them, take them to the next level. But if we want to talk about change, they've been light in free agency situation. That could have been pretty nasty, losing that, him being such a huge flexible piece for them in and out of the backfield. But last year, J.C. Jackson was supposed to be a pretty big boon to this defense. So, I mean, is this going to be, kind of a rebound type of situation? Derwin James thing has to be frustrating because, I mean, his injuries really since coming into the league have been tough for this defense to kind of get around. I looked, I'm looking at what the 4th highest amount of cap, of salary was tied up on the injured reserve last year. So, I mean, you talked about all of those key pieces missing significant time from this team, both offense and defense. So, kind of the injury unluck type of situation needs to flip in their favor. Although, the questions about the team medical staff over the years, I guess your staff with a needle recently. So I have faith in this team being productive, but also am a skeptic of whether the execution and the decision making is going to hold them back again. But 340 to win the division. Again, we just talked about KC being the class of the division, but the Chargers are the biggest challenger to them. And getting a win against KC and getting some more favorable outcomes, staying off the IR, could make. I mean, I haven't bet it, and I'm not sure whether it's worth the money to do so.
Yeah, despite all, I think that injury piece is a big one to talk about, and you both brought that up, and I think that's great. I just counted, and 5 of their 7 losses were by less than a score. And I know this is the NFL. A lot of teams lose games by 1 score or less, right? But 5 out of 7, I mean, they were in all those games. So,
I would be curious to see going back, I don't know, even with the last 5 in 1 score games. It just seems like they find amazing ways to win games that they should win coming down the end of the game. But again, that's not statistically based. That's just kind of like eye test. But I don't know. That's what holds me back from being overly bullish on them, even though they are the second best team in this division.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the first 8 games. So I actually have them at 5-3 as well. Yanni, where do you have them?
Yeah, same. 5-3. Actually, my gut when I did this the first time was 4-4, but I kind of went back and did a little adjustment there. So, same thing. I think again, you could definitely say that they have the most talented roster in the division and potentially one of the most talented rosters in the NFL. So, I realize I'm kind of beating a dead horse here, but there's no reason why they shouldn't be 5-3 or 6-2 after those games. We just haven't seen it yet, which is why I, gut feeling went 4-4 and 5-3 there. I mean, we got to see more, but kind of like the Chiefs, I think they're in that same boat where if they were 6-2, if they stayed healthy, I wouldn't be shocked. I could look at that and say, okay, yeah, you could make a case that they could win. You could make a case they could win any of those games, honestly. And I think they are definitely the prototypical any given Sunday team. They can beat anyone on any given Sunday. So, we got to see it from Brandon Staley. We got to see it from staying healthy. We got to see it from, Justin Herbert, stepping up and matching that physical greatness he has with that mental greatness and all that. But I don't know. Long way of saying 5-3 as well.
Yeah. JJ, anything different, or you kind of see it similar?
Boring. Yeah, I'm boring.
Yeah.
Same.
Okay.
I mean, but they have the potential to be even better. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. All right. Let's any bets. I don't have any player props. I will just throw out the one bet, and I haven't made this yet, but this is in my as we've been doing these shows, I would say about half the time when I've said I'm thinking about betting something, I've gone and actually bet it later as I keep thinking about it. And I'll be curious your guys' thoughts too. But the one that I'm seriously considering is the Chargers to make the playoffs at -120. I think that when I look across the divisions, I don't think the AFC South gets more than one team, even though it's certainly an easy division. So easiest schedules because they get to play each other. But the other 3 divisions in the AFC are going to kind of beat up on each other. And we have to talk about the Raiders yet, who I don't feel as terrible about as I did before I looked before, but they are the one team out of these divisions where I'm like, yeah, probably people can pretty much beat them. So, I mean, if the Chargers can take care of those games, the Broncos, I mean, I think there's upside there, but I just think the AFC North and the AFC East are more stacked than the AFC West even. But I do think, Yanni, to your point, that the Chargers have as much talent as almost any team in the league. And so for them to just make the playoffs, come in second in this division, I think is a pretty good bet. And it's not quite even money, but it's close. So that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I think you could absolutely consider that. My fear is this. I think some of you may have seen the graphic where you've seen Josh Allen, Aaron Rodgers, Tua, Joe Burrow, Lamar Jackson, Deshaun Watson, and, all the quarterbacks in the AFC. And it's like 3 of these guys are going to miss the playoffs. And obviously Herbert's on that graphic. So, that's the thing that scares me when you look at the AFC is because there are so many good teams and so many good players. I mean, look, I think we would probably, I don't want to speak for you guys, but I would probably have the Chargers as the second best team in the NFC if it were me. Maybe the third, depending upon whatever. Third, you could say third, fourth, whatever. But you could argue they're the second best team in the NFC. When you look at that AFC, I mean, I think you bring up a good point about those other divisions beating themselves up. But for me, I would almost rather take the approach of what JJ said and said, give me the bigger payoff with the 340 to have them win their division. Obviously, that would get them in the playoffs. but it kind of eliminates a lot of those other teams, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, the Jets, teams that we think could be good, maybe, but we don't know. So I'd rather go for the big payoff personally if I were going to take a chance on this Chargers team because of that volatility. It's like, okay, if they end up being, 7-10 because they're injured and Brandon Staley's an idiot, then okay, whatever, I lost. But can they overtake the Chiefs? Maybe. And it plus 340. I mean, to me, and I could be wrong, but when you look at the other division odds, the gap between the Chiefs and the Chargers to me doesn't seem huge, at least on paper. And again, we could talk about the intangibles all day long. But on paper, it doesn't seem to be that big. And when you look at some of the other divisions and you see the second place team being plus 240 or plus 275, and then you look at this at plus 340, that seems a little bit high to me. So I think if I were looking at this team, I would prefer, and I don't think I'm going to, because again, I don't trust the volatility there, but I think that plus 340 to win the division is actually, for me, the way I would go if I were going to play that.
All right. Any other props or bets that you're looking at relating to the Chargers?
Yeah, I just have Justin Herbert over passing yards. He's at 4,450. He's gone the last 2 years, 4,700 and 5,000. So, he's eclipsed that. And I think with the addition of Quentin Johnson and a healthy offensive line, Keenan Allen and Mike Williams hopefully not missing time. I mean, throwing for 4,700 yards with what he had to deal with between offensive line shuffling and Allen and Williams in and out of the lineup, and he still went over that by 250 yards, 300 yards. So to me, I think his passing yards are very, very appetizing.
Great. JJ, any props for you, or no, not on the
No,
Chargers?
sir.
None on the Chargers. All right. Well, let's move on to team number 4, both in order and in standings in the AFC West. The Las Vegas Raiders over under 6.5. Don't get mad at me, Raiders fans. I just mean that's where Vegas has them. That's all I mean. Over under 6.5, minus 118 to the over, and plus 108 to the under, plus 1,400 to win the division. They start out with 2 games on the road at Denver and then at the mighty Buffalo Bills. Pittsburgh comes to town in game 3. They go to the Chargers. Then they get Green Bay at home on a Monday night, New England at home, and then they go on the road again to take on 2 NFC North opponents, the Bears and the Lions. Yanni, I remember from a month or two ago that you were definitely not high on the Raiders. As we get a little closer to the season, how are you feeling about them?
I'm still not high on the Raiders. And let me say this: it has less to do with the Raiders and more to do with the situation, which you talked about, which I just mentioned about. We said 3 of these quarterbacks are going to miss the playoffs, and we're naming Justin Herbert and Joe Burrow and whatever. So if those guys aren't getting in the playoffs, if 3 of those guys aren't getting in, you're going to tell me that this Raiders team in that division with Jimmy Garoppolo is getting in the playoffs? I can't buy it. It's not that they're a bad team, because I don't think they are. They have a little bit about what we talked about with the Denver Broncos, which is you put them in the NFC, they're probably making the freaking playoffs. I mean, they're at least contending to get in the playoffs. But in that AFC, it's like someone has to lose. And how do you make a case for some of these being less or worse than this Raiders team? I just can't do it. And that's not to say they don't have talent. I think Max Crosby might be the most underrated player in the league. I think he's phenomenal. Obviously, we saw what Josh Jacobs did. Of course, there's some question marks on whether or not he's even going to be on the field. I think he will. But, there's some question marks there. You have a guy like Devontae Adams, who some people think is the best receiver in the league. So, I mean, they have some nice pieces there. The offensive line is solid. But and actually, I like the addition of Jacoby Myers opposite of Devontae Adams. I think that, that gives them some ability over there, some flexibility in the passing game where it doesn't all have to be on Devontae Adams with Hunter Renfrow there. So, I think there's a lot to like about this Raiders team, but the problem is the quarterback position, and this isn't a slight on Jimmy G. He's just not on the level of Patrick Mahomes and Justin Herbert and, Joe Burrow and all these other guys that we talk about in the AFC. He's just not there. So when you look at that and then you look at the defense, and this defense wasn't good last year. They were 30th in defensive EPA and 28th in scoring. And they really didn't do anything that I see to make them substantially better in those categories. So even if they improve a little bit, this offense is going to have to absolutely light it up. And do we trust Jimmy G to light it up? I know I don't. So, when I look at this team, unfortunately, it's not that they're a bad football team, but I think their record's going to be bad. And I will say this is a team to me that could be, when we look back at the end of next season and we look at against the spread records, I wouldn't be shocked if the Raiders have a good record against the spread. But I don't think their overall record is going to be there.
Yeah, I like that point, Yanni. JJ, when you look at the Raiders, what are you thinking?
A mess. So, I mean, in terms of the franchise from the top down, I mean, take a step back and look at last year. But they brought in Davante Adams. He's excited to be with his boy Carr, and they ran him out of town. And so now they brought in Jimmy G, who's a legend in somebody's mind. I mean, nothing, again, he said no slight against him, but even if you're willing to put the health issues aside, the durability issues, him missing weeks and all that, the question then becomes, is Josh McDaniels the guy to get more out of him than Shanahan? And, whether or not the relationship with Shanahan was all that good or not, is another point altogether. But, the fact that McDaniels wants to be once okay, he's got his guy. But now you have a Davante Adams who's, probably questioned his decision to join this team, and you got Josh Jacobs, holding out. Now, like Yanni said, he's probably going to be on this field. I mean, he needs to get paid. He wants to get paid, etc. But there's just so many distractions, if you will. And are we convinced that Josh McDaniels is going to take the next step as an NFL head coach? So, when you add all these questions up, key parts of the team, the head coach, the quarterback, a defense that is severely underperformed, even with Max Crosby, you can game plan for one guy. So the question becomes, are they going to be able to move forward with a Chargers team that could be better, but still has firepower, a Denver team that should be better offensively, and then the Kansas City Chiefs. So it's an extreme uphill battle, not just with the X's and O's, but with the discussion to the other teams in the division. This is a huge uphill climb. So I just have a lot of skepticism towards the organization as a whole. We just talked about me being skeptical in terms of the Chargers being able to get out of their own way when it comes to moving beyond the statistics and the metrics. The Vegas, they have the metrics and the statistics working against them, as well as a lot of these, personnel and relationship type of things on top of the whole organizational problems from the top down. So I don't have much confidence in this organization as a whole right now.
JJ, I like when you bring the organizational pieces, because I think it's easy for me to get kind of lost in the players and the dynamics on the field, which are obviously important, but some of those other dynamics are important too, right? And I think you're right about the difficulty this franchise has had from the top of the organization down. I don't really disagree. I don't think I really disagree with anything you guys have said. My main thoughts were just I had thought of the Raiders as one of the bottom teams in the league, and maybe they'll end up there because of their division and their schedule. But when you look at, I did think this offensive skill group is good. And Yanni, you said that, but I mean, to have Davante Adams, Hunter Renfrow, and then they picked up Jacoby Myers, who has been good in New England, maybe not great, but good. And they have a couple other veteran kind of journeyman NFL receivers, which I think is not bad to have some depth behind. And then they have Austin Hooper. They drafted Michael Mayer. So, and then if Josh Jacobs is there, man, I think this skill group is really good. The problem is you didn't want to diss on Jimmy G too much. I will. I think he's a downgrade. I mean, they got rid of Derek Carr, and then they got somebody worse to take his place. What the hell are they thinking? So I know that Derek Carr has his issues, and I think I said when we talked about the Saints, I don't necessarily believe in him 100%, but I'll take him over Jimmy G any day. I mean, one of the things, I know I bring up turnovers all the time, and they're hard to gauge, but I do think it's something that matters. And you go and look last year, when he played, he had a good interception percentage, 1.3%, but he's been 2.7% or higher every other season, which is really bad for a starting quarterback in the NFL. He's going to be playing behind an offensive line that isn't great. So yes, he has great skill position guys. Maybe he can just toss it up to Devontae Adams, but I think he could make a lot of mistakes here as well. And then on the defensive side, yes, I like their pass rush just like everybody else does. I like what you said about Max Crosby. That's why I had him on the graphic, right? Instead of Jimmy G. That's why I put Max Crosby on there. Great. But what else? I mean, with the offensive lines in this division, if they can slow that pass rush down, these quarterbacks are just going to shred this defense. So while I like pieces of the Raiders, it's almost like, what was the team, Yanni? I think it was the Commanders, where you had said there are pieces on this team that if you were playing GM, you'd be like, oh, I'll take that guy and I'll take that guy. I think the Raiders are similar. They have some really good pieces in Las Vegas, and maybe over time, though the organization piece calls it into question that JJ brought up, maybe they could build around that and get to where they can be more competitive. But when you have like a third of a team that's good, that's just not going to cut it in the NFL, and especially in the AFC, and definitely not in this division. So I think they struggle for all of those reasons. I think we've all kind of been on the same page with that. But Yanni, I loved your comment. I think Raiders spread is definitely something to watch, especially, I mean, maybe even against some of these better teams. Maybe they can keep it close, but especially when they play some of these teams, like when they get Green Bay coming to town or New England comes to Las Vegas, like depending on how things look at that point, I think looking at them against the spread could be a good angle this year to pay attention to. So I have them 2-6 through the first 8. I'll talk a little bit more about those first 8 when we talk about our kind of props or other bets. Yanni, where do you have them after 8?
Yeah, I ended up going 2-6 as well. They tend to fight, right? I mean, they showed some fight last year, and I think they'll fight again, but I think it's just going to be too much for them to overcome. And we don't need to belabor the point, so I'll keep it real brief. But this isn't fantasy football. I mean,
Right.
You want Devontae Adams, you want Josh Jacobs, you want a guy like Max Crosby on your defense. But what did we start this podcast off talking about? Coach, quarterback, offensive line. We have a very questionable coach in Josh McDaniels. We have call him mediocre quarterback in Jimmy Garoppolo, and maybe a little better than mediocre offensive line. I think their offensive line's decent, but to me, that's just not going to be enough. So I think when you look at those first 8 games, you can make a case that they could win 3 or 4 of them, but you could also make a case that they could lose every single one of those. So I think when you kind of look at that, I'll split the middle there and say, okay, they're not going to go 0-8. They're probably not going to win 4 of those. So give me that 2-6 there. And that's probably what this team is going to be this year.
JJ, any disagreement?
Yeah, no disagreement. And I mean, this is the NFL, and as long as you have a decent amount of skilled players and Max, those offensive type weapons, you can stumble into a couple of wins. That's for sure. And even though we've seen the degradation of home field advantage across the league, for the last whatever years, there's no home field that is more inviting to spaces than the city of Las Vegas as far as people going there. It's, we saw that it's not the black hole of years old. So that has been acting against them, I guess you would say, and should continue. But nonetheless, I'm on par with the rest of you. It's not an 0 for team by any means. But it's going to be a constant uphill struggle for them.
If I can say real quick, I almost brought that up with the Chargers, that you also have no home field advantage when you're the Chargers. And I think what's really interesting in this division is 2 of the best home field advantages in the league are Kansas City and Denver. Probably the 2 worst home field advantages are the Chargers and the Raiders. So those teams have a distinct disadvantage in that compared to Kansas City and Denver, which that's not generally the case. In most of the divisions, that home field advantage is pretty similar, right? We don't get that in this division. There's a big disparity between Kansas City and Denver actually having a home field advantage versus the Chargers and the Raiders having that as not necessarily a disadvantage, but certainly not an advantage.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's talk about prop bets or other bets. I'll let you guys. I have a couple. Mine are both related to their wins, not to specific players. Yanni, you've had some all along the way here. Anything that sticks out to you with the Raiders?
Well, I won't steal your thunder if you've got a win total. I mean,
Oh no, go for it, man.
I lean under, and again, I hate to do that when you see guys like Devontae Adams and Max Crosby and top 15, 20 type players in the league. But I lean under. I just think that there's too much stacked against them. So I like that. And then, I also lean under on Devontae Adams yards here, and not because I don't think he's a great player. But when you look at the addition of Jacoby Myers and you look at, a guy like Austin Hooper coming in and you got Hunter Renfrow, I think that ball gets spread around. And not to mention this team does like to run the ball. But I think the biggest thing is when you saw Devontae Adams putting up 1,500 yards in Green Bay, and even last year, they were force feeding him that ball. And I think that Aaron Rodgers and Derek Carr, that was it. You mentioned it. Derek Carr was his guy. Like, he came there, and I mean, there were games where I guarantee you, if we pulled the box score, there were games where Devontae Adams had 14 targets and the next closest guy had 4, and I mean, that's obviously the way it should be with an all-pro type receiver. But Jimmy G is not that guy. When you look back at his time in San Francisco, he spreads the ball around. He was the type of guy that had, 3 targets to 8 different receivers. So I think with the skill guys, like you mentioned, Renfrow and Myers and Hooper, and them wanting to run the ball, I don't think Adams does get there this year, as good of a player as he is. So I'll take the under on Devontae Adams.
And you got to like when you go under too. And I think those were good points as to why. So JJ, any thoughts on bets on the Raiders for you?
I love what Yanni just said. I mean, we talked about everything. Everything kind of lines up. Yeah, sure. He's one of the top wide receivers in the league. So you're not going to take that away from him. But there are a lot of different elements stacked against him in terms of that rapport and just kind of distribution. That pass distribution was huge.
My only concern, honestly, on Devontae Adams is, do they trade him to somewhere where there's a real quarterback this year? But I mean, I don't know that you can not take it because of that. So, so I have 2 bets that are related to the schedule. And the first one, Yanni, is just to say, especially at plus money, I actually lean to the under 2. And just thinking about how good I think the Raiders are, I'm like, man, I don't think I'd want to take the under on this team just to get to 7 wins. That doesn't sound too bad. But I was just going through the schedule, and I imagine that they will be favored in 3 games. Now, obviously, anything can happen. Things can change. But I look through their schedule, and it's like, I don't think they'll be favored against the teams in their division. Maybe against Denver at home, depending on how everything's breaking this year. That's the last game of the season, so that's 1 maybe. But then they've got like Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Chargers. Okay, Green Bay at home, maybe they would be favored there. New England, at Chicago, maybe they're favored there. At Detroit, whatever. I don't need to go through the whole thing, but the schedule is hard. And so if I think you're going to be favored in 3, maybe I give you 4 games and your total is 6.5 and I'm getting plus money on the under. That's actually what I'm thinking about taking. And I talk a lot about how to approach futures. I think this is a place where you might get the opportunity to middle if you want to as well, because the other bet that I don't know if I'll make it, but that I'd at least consider is for the odds. I think they may be the best team in the league for the last winless team at plus 1,800. And it's not because they're the worst team in the league by any means, but you look at Arizona, like, who are the other shitty teams? Arizona, well, they have Washington the first week. They have the Giants the second week. I think they have at least a chance in those games. Do I think they're going to win? No. But those aren't killer teams. By week 6, they play the Rams too. So, I mean, there's at least some chances there. You go down to Washington, another team that I think will suck. They have Arizona, as I talked about. Week 5, they have Chicago at home on a Thursday. I think that's a pretty good spot for Washington for them to get a win. You go to Vegas, they start out at Denver, then they have to go to Buffalo. They play Pittsburgh, then they go to the Chargers. So I don't see it being a high percentage chance that they win any of their first 4 games. Then they get Green Bay and New England at home, which are winnable games, but I don't think are layups. And then they go to Chicago, another winnable game. So I'm not saying I'll bet it, but at plus 1,800, I think they could definitely be in the mix if a couple of those other teams can squeak out a win in the first 4 weeks. And I think the under 6.5 at plus money makes sense to me here. That's definitely something I'm considering, just given the schedule.
Yeah, I like that winless, last team to win bet there. And, what did we say when we were talking about the first 8? I said, hey, realistically, I could see this team being 0-8 after 8. I mean, there's not a layup there that you would look and say, oh yeah, they'll win that game. Like we said, could they win 4 of them? Sure. We have them at 2-6. I could see them losing every one of those games, and not to jump on this point too much again, but you mentioned the quote unquote winnable games, Green Bay coming into their house. We don't know yet exactly how Green Bay is going to be. And oh, by the way, that stadium is going to be 90% green and gold in that game. So, again, going back to that home field advantage there, that's not a home game. I'm sorry. That's going to be a road game for them in terms of noise and whatever. And, so you start looking at that. I think that's a really interesting bet. And I feel like at 18-1, that payoff is pretty nice, man. That's not bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where is that at? It's kind of interesting.
I think, it was at DraftKings. I did write down the books here where I got these. So that was at DraftKings.
Cool.
All right. Well, last thing before we get out of here, I think I might know your answer because of the conversation we've already had. But if you had to pick a team to bet, not saying we are betting them, but if you had to pick one to win the division at the current odds, so I think we'd all probably say the Chiefs if it was just straight up. But the Chiefs are -160, Chargers +340, Denver +700, and then the Raiders +1400. Where would you go with a bet if you had to make one, given those prices? Yanni, how about you?
Yeah, I kind of already said it. I mean, obviously, if we're just saying who's going to win the division, I think, Kansas City's the answer there. But for the last, 2 years, I think the Chargers have kind of been the trendy answer there. And maybe one of these years they'll get it done. So I think when you look at that, again, I mentioned them probably in my mind being more at that like +250, +270 type range. And a +340, give me the Chargers, man. We use that term value very generically in sports betting. Right. But I mean, I feel like truly with the bang for your buck, that's where I'm going with this division.
Same for you, JJ, or would you go a different way?
I feeling the Chargers, I would agree. So Vegas, no. Denver, 7-1, is tempting, but the gap and to jump 2 teams ahead of them is the biggest challenge. And I think that's fairly priced. The 340, I think, to win the division with the Chargers makes a lot of sense to me. If we're going with a team that is not Kansas City.
Yeah, I don't think I would bet it, but I think I would say the Broncos at +700. And I think the Broncos, Chargers, whatever. Maybe it's a coin flip to me. But I really do think that the Broncos are one of the teams that, in my mind, has kind of a low floor but a really high ceiling, because I do like their defense. I don't see as much of an Achilles heel on the defense as I do with the Chargers, so that's something that I like about the Broncos. And I think if they can create that balance with the run and pass, and Peyton can – I just think so much to me is going to be interesting with Russell Wilson, because if you guys remember back – it wasn't just me. The way that people in general were talking about the Broncos, if Russ was going to be Russ last year, was with a pretty high ceiling. And so I think that if he can get that out of Russ, 7-1 to me is pretty good. But because of all the uncertainty, I don't think it's a bet I would make.
Right. So. And the flip side was just how terrible the Seahawks were going to be. So that was a very interesting, preseason dynamic that turned out to be totally, upside down. But
so true.
Yes, don't disagree. The question that I had for you is 4-1.
We lost you.
If we saw, would it be worth 450, 400, 500 if Denver, we saw that relationship with Peyton and Wilson in a better offensive scheme, using more of Wilson's skill set at this point in his career? If we saw that actually starting to click, would it be worth taking a little bit of haircut off that 7-1 to get a little bit of on field, to see them play it out and see some sort of success?
I'll give you my answer on that. I think, we always talk about not overreacting to one game in the NFL, whether that's in the NFL or in sports betting. But I think that if we saw a couple weeks where this Denver offense looked electric, meaning Peyton had him clicking and whatever, I absolutely think you could take that chance at that point. I would absolutely be willing to trim that +700 down a little bit, with a little bit of proof that this offense can get it going. So, to answer your question, if this team comes out of the gate and they're putting 30 plus points up and they look electric, I would be all over that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, Yanni. looking at their schedule, I think I would probably want to wait until after 3 games because they play the Raiders at home in the first game. I'm not sure how much stock I'd want to put in that against that defense,
Sure.
but Washington has a good defense, and I think Miami will have a pretty good defense. So those next couple games will be good tests for that offense.
Good test.
I think.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. Anything else on the AFC West? Head shakes. All right. Head shakes all around. Well, it's been fun, fellas. Thanks for jumping on to break down what is a fun division. And we got two more bangers to go in the AFC and one that will do. So it should be fun. Appreciate it, and we will talk to you next week.
Take care, guys.
Good to be back.